Hi everyone, you are listening to another episode of Geek U.S.A. And this week we are going to be discussing the Canadian singer-songwriter Matthew Good. Now, I know what most of you are probably thinking. Usually we're talking about things like Star Trek and Dream Theater and Metallica. So you're probably wondering, how does Matthew Good fit into all of this? Well, first and foremost, I'm a huge fan, and Matthew Good just released his latest album, Something Like a Storm. So while many of you might remember a couple minor alternative rock radio hits from the 90s, the song Apparitions, the song Strange Days, you might be surprised to hear that Matthew Good has had a long and successful solo career, releasing what are, in my opinion, some of the most important rock records of the last 20 years. And if all of that sounds like I'm geeking out on Matthew Good, well, it's because I am. So this week, Carl and I are going to discuss all things Matthew Good. All right, Carl, so this week we are going to be talking about Matthew Good. And I kind of said this at the top of the podcast, but I'm going to reiterate. I'm sure lots of people who are listening to this, if they've made it this far, are asking themselves, Matthew Good? Like, where's the Dream Theater? Where's the Metallica? But for those who have been listening to us for a long time will know that we have a affinity for all things Canadian rock. And we've already done a Big Wreck podcast. We've already done a Tea Party podcast, and I just felt like it was time to do a Matthew Good podcast. Now, before we get started, I think I've been a Matthew Good honk for, as long as I can remember. I'm not so sure you were. So give me your impressions and maybe tell everybody what you did to prepare for this podcast.
Well, what I did to prepare for the podcast was I listened to Matthew Good's entire discography from the Matthew Good band all the way through. And this is going to be interesting because in a very rare this is going to be a very rare occasion of you and I probably disagreeing a lot, and a rare occasion of me probably pissing off a lot of Canadians. So this will be good.
Well, I guess that, yes, I make no bones about it. I'm a huge honk and a huge fan for the artist, but
yeah, this is just going to be a nice fan wank for you. But
maybe it's good for a change. You get to ask me what the big deal is as opposed to me asking you what the big deal is on stuff. So I'm going to give some background real quick, and then I'm going to kind of get your thoughts and impressions as we roll through his discography. A lot of people probably remember Matthew Good from the Matthew Good Band. In fact, most of the people listening to this podcast, I think most of our audience appears to be from the U.S. And so there was this thing in the 90s called Much Music, which was a Canadian MTV that some of us lucky folks in the United States got on our cable television boxes. And on that Much Music, you saw all these other bands we've talked about, Big Wreck, Matthew Good. You saw these bands all the time. So, Carl, do you remember Much Music, and do you remember, Matthew Good being on Much Music back in the day?
I remember Much Music, and I do remember Matthew Good being on it back in the day. We didn't have Much Music forever, and the thing about a big difference between a guy like Matthew Good and Big Wreck was, Ian Thornley and Big Wreck didn't get, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase a big long story here, but didn't get fed up with America and American music media. So you still got more exposure with Big Wreck here than Matthew Good. I mean, Much Music was essentially at a certain point. Much Music was the only way that Americans were really going to get exposed to Matthew Good unless they knew somebody who recommended something, unless they went out looking for it. So if you didn't have Much Music, that was pretty much going to be it. If you didn't have Much Music, you were going to see Blown Wide Open, and the video for I had another video, I forgot the Oaf. You're going to see those videos on MTV for a bit. Mm-hmm. Not Matthew Good.
No, so I think the thing I remember back in the day is, all those bands made an impression. I mean, the Matthew Good Band, I think I especially enjoyed. There was just something, the lyrics, the vocal delivery. It just hit me right away. And for those who remember, at that point in time, it was a very rich time period for alternative rock across the board. But I felt like these Canadian bands, and I don't know how you feel about this, but if we're going to talk about music that we liked 20 years ago that we still listen to, I'll be damned if every one of these bands that I saw on MTV or on Much Music I don't still like. I mean, this is music that stood the test of time and that really kind of cut through. There was a lot of bands coming out of the United States. Like, I don't listen to Third Eye Blind. I don't. Are you serious? Why would I? But do you know what I mean? But that was their peers, and I think that while these bands didn't necessarily cross over and become huge in the United States, I feel like there was just a little bit there. This was the cream of the Canadian crop, and we got some really good music coming out of the mid to late '90s out of Canada. So Matthew Good, the Matthew Good Band, begins in Canada in the early 90s. Matthew Good goes through he's in a couple different bands. He's doing his thing. Eventually, in 1995, the lineup that's going to become the Matthew Good Band solidifies. Now, a very interesting thing happens. They're not the Matthew Good Band. In fact, they were originally going to call themselves Snow Axe, and then they were going to call themselves Gandalf. And in a move that probably saved their careers, before they could settle on a name, a local radio station began playing a song that was to become off their first record, which was Underdog, or Last of the Ghetto Astronauts. And the song was Alabama Motel Room. Now, the radio DJ was announcing the song as the Matthew Good Band because, well, Matthew Good, who's this guy everybody knows, is in this band, and I don't know what they're called. There's nothing on the CD of the Matthew Good Band, and that name stuck, and probably for better than worse. Last of the Ghetto Astronauts was released in 1995. It was recorded for $5,000, and it sounds amazing. Huge singles in Canada, not really anywhere else, but symbolistic White Walls especially. And I've always been a huge fan of Haven't Slept in Years. I think this is a great record, kind of giving you a glimpse of what the band was going to become, but still very much like lyrically driven songs, a little rough around the edges, which I really like. What is your thoughts on this record, Carl?
It's a good debut start for a band, for sure. I enjoy it. Some of the album to me doesn't seem like it really goes anywhere. I like Haven't Slept in Years. I think that's really good. It does. I don't know. I thought Native Son and Every Name were kind of a snooze fest, and I thought New Disguise was a little boring. So I just think it kind of comes after a few of those. So for me, the album meanders a little bit, but for the most part, I mean, it starts really good. It ends actually pretty okay. So it's just not my favorite of theirs by a long shot, but it's not bad. I do like it.
Well, the next record the band would release. So the band releases Last of the Ghetto Astronauts and starts touring the country, and it picks up steam. And so the band goes back into the studio and records Underdogs. Now, Underdogs is going to be their breakthrough album, and anybody who's familiar with the Matthew Good Band is familiar with them because of this record. So Matthew Good starts his relationship with Warren Livesey. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, and he says it all the time in interviews. Warren is, he had produced some Midnight Oil records. Matt was a big fan of his, and it's really interesting because they're going to have a relationship that kind of continues on for the remainder of his career. But Underdogs, the first thing you notice when you listen to this record is it freaking sounds amazing. It sounds, 90s alternative rock at this point had really kind of centered on you were either going to be a band with big, loud, crunchy guitars, or you were going to sound like the Counting Crows. And this was something in the middle. But also, this album had a couple huge singles. So Everything Is Automatic, and of course, Apparitions, the power ballad of all power ballads that I still have stuck in my head 20 years later. So, Carl, talk to me about Underdogs.
Yeah, Underdogs I think is fantastic. This is when I think they kind of start sounding like really good to me. Bear with me here because I made a little note on this. So I was listening to everything here through Amazon Music, and Amazon Music was kind of had a problem was jumbling up albums a little bit. Underdogs was 90. Yeah, it was really weird. Amazon Music on my phone, and it was like mislabeling albums. Like I would click Underdogs, and the opening track was Giant, and I'm like, that's not the right album at all. But so anyway, Deep Six starts this one off, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So This album is good. There's some songs there that I think are okay. They're not my favorites. I don't think that they're super standout. Like I like Middle Class Gangsters. It's okay. I like Prime Deliverance, but Apparitions is great. Deep Six is great. Strangers of All, is great. I think last like 5 or 6 after Prime Time Deliverance, I think is fantastic. So this is one of those. It's one of those albums where, everybody probably knew who Matthew Good was because of this album, but it makes sense because the album was great.
Well, the band, Canada agreed. The band won a Juno. The album was certified double platinum. This record, I think, really solidified the Matthew Good Band. And the way I describe Matthew Good Band and how they are different from Matthew Good, the solo artist, is really the band behind the man. So Ian Brown on drums, the super hard-hitting, in-the-pocket drummer. You had Jeff Lloyd on bass. And then you had Dave Genn. And as a guitar player, and I know there's a lot of drama that's occurred between the band members in the years after the split. And we're not really going to get into that. But for all intents and purposes, Dave was the perfect counterpoint to Matt. He's a guitar player that I've only grown to appreciate more and more in the years. All of his solos and leads are just weird. He reminds me of like a Canadian James Iha, to Matthew Good's Billy Corgan. Like, he finds a way to make himself work in all of the songs without just being your traditional cock rock guitar player. And on this record, I think you really start to see the counterpoint with the band underneath the music. So this is a record I've come back to year after year, and I've continued to find things in it that I enjoy. And a lot of people, including the record labels, felt that maybe Matthew Good had a chance at being someone that could really cross over in the United States. So the third record, which the band had already begun recording, Beautiful Midnight, was released in 1999 in the U.S. Now, I don't know if you were working at the Exchange at the time, but I was, and I remember these videos being all over MTV, all over Much Music, and this record was actually something I bought, and it was available in the U.S., and it came out. And the interesting thing about Beautiful Midnight is the record companies, in their infinite wisdom, decided to release multiple track listings. So if you were in Canada, you got one track listing. If you were in the U.S., you got another one where they replaced songs with previous singles from the last record. So like my version of Beautiful Midnight has Apparitions on it. It also has Load Me Up. It also has Deep Six. So it was a weird mashup that I had to buy this record 3 times to get all the songs that were originally on it. But Carl, besides that, I think that Beautiful Midnight, beginning with the epic, crushing song Giant, is just genius. Talk to me about this record. Are you a fan of this record?
This is the only record they have that I like from start to finish. Whereas, I think Underdogs is great. There may be some tracks where I'm just not as high on. I honestly don't think that there's a track on Beautiful Midnight that I don't like. And I listened to, I did wind up listening to the non-US version one way or the other. I think I had to go to YouTube because I noticed the same thing. So first I thought it was Amazon just being Amazon again. So I pulled this up. I'm like, wait, Deep Six is on this one too? What? No, that's not. So I look into it, and I think I had to go to YouTube for the rest of it. But this album, from one end to the other, Giant and Hello Time Bomb, all the way through Born to Kill and Running Home, is not only the high watermark for Matthew Good Band. I think this is going to be the best thing we ever hear from Matthew Good. Period.
You're not the only person who thinks that. I think for a lot of people, this is really the record that set the band apart from the alternative rock fray. Where like bands like the Tea Party, grew disheartened with their inability to break into the, American music scene. I feel like Matthew Good almost defiantly enjoyed the fact that they weren't doing it. And he was at this point in time, he had become kind of well known for his quirkiness and maybe his abrasiveness in interviews. He was having a difficult time, I think, adjusting to the, level of fame the band was achieving. And this record, I think, really reflects that, especially in some of the lyrics, kind of his, that disconnection between your day-to-day life and then the life as a celebrity. But songs like Born to Kill, A Boy and His Machine Gun, like just these big, heavy, crushing, epic songs. Like nobody else was doing this. And the more upbeat songs like Load Me Up and Hello Time Bomb, I think are genius. The single Strange Days, it's an amazing video. It's a beautiful song. I don't think...
That is a great tune.
It is just a well-written song, like from the arrangement to the vocal. And Matthew Good as a vocalist might not... Like, this is one of his high watermarks. He's got range. Lyrically, like, these songs are dialed in. This record still kills me to this day, and the record did amazing. So the band was humming along, and the only thing that could stop them was themselves. And unfortunately, tensions within the band, tensions over publishing, tensions over songwriting credits, tensions over everything began to surface, especially between guitarist Dave Genn and Matthew Good. So the next record, The Audio of Being, would become a very tumultuous one and would ultimately be the band's last record. So Carl, before I jump into the background on this, what were your thoughts on Audio of Being? Did you even know this record existed before listening?
Oh, no, I had no idea. I mean, to be frank with you, I didn't know anything about Matthew Good before we really did this. The Audio of Being is... It is part of a great 1-2 punch. I don't like the I the throwaway. Aside from that, I think the entire album kicks. Yeah. I think Man of Action's is a great opener. Honestly, if you took the throwaway off of this, I probably would like it better than Beautiful Midnight. Wow. Like I'd probably score it just a little higher. I really like this album a lot. Sort of a protest song is great. I just think the whole thing is a the whole album's fantastic, except for the throwaway. And maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I don't know why I heard that song like this is kind of dumb, but for the most part, if this being the last album by a band, the tumultuous nature of ending a band, it can always kind of suck. But if this is where Matthew Good's career ended, it would have ended, I think, on a pretty high note. I don't think he could have been too disappointed. Obviously, he goes on to have a very prolific career on his own, but this was a pretty damn good last effort by a band.
Well, and I was like a lot of people, I think, and maybe even like you, I bought Beautiful Midnight and I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed Matthew Good, and I kept listening to music, obviously, but somehow this band and this artist fell off my radar for like a decade. And when I finally went back and dove into Matthew Good, I was stunned to find out there was an album after Beautiful Midnight. And I remember listening to it and thinking, Jesus Christ, this album's amazing. Why did they break up? And it's the story behind the record that really leads to the breakup. So the tension, Matthew Good, was diagnosed with a lung disease. He started to have vocal issues. He was having issues with his wife. He felt like the record company was pressuring him. He actually writes the song Anti-Pop as an FU to the freaking record company, and then they turn around and release it as a single. He felt like his entire life was spinning out of control, and he did not know what to do. And I don't feel like you get any of that listening to the record. It actually sounds incredibly cohesive to me. But it was not a cohesive effort to make it. So while the band releases the record, and the record does marginally well, it does not capitalize on the success that they had with Beautiful Midnight, at least not in the States. And I think a lot of that had to do with Matthew Good himself being just kind of over the process. And so the band goes their separate ways. And that is where...
Yeah, actually... edit this part out and forget I said anything.
Well, no. What was your thought?
No, honestly, my thought was going to be completely out of order and just left my noggin. So finish what I know exactly where you're going to go, and I'll give you my thought.
Well, for a lot of people, for most people, I think that might be where the story ends. But that's kind of where the story of Matthew Good, at least for me, begins. So the Matthew Good, the artist, decides to no longer work in the context of a band and decides he's going to make a solo record. And Carl, in 2003, Matthew Good releases Avalanche. Now, the first thing people would notice right off the bat was that it wasn't that dramatic of a departure. Maybe a little bit more refined, maybe produced a little differently. This particular record, he has the entire thing kind of covered with the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. And he kind of takes everything he was doing on the Matthew Good band and kind of maybe just cuts away the more alternative rock, like upbeat stuff, and really focuses on mood and vibe. Carl, I think Avalanche is like a perfect album. And I think it's not only a perfect album in terms of like writing, but the performance. I don't think Matthew Good has ever since or ever before sang with so much emotion or range. He nails these songs, and these songs are carried by his voice. The album was a huge hit in Canada. Weapon and In a World Called Catastrophe were both very big singles. And at this point, I think the United States ship had sailed. He was done trying to even do anything like that. He was just going to be a solo artist to make his records. And this record as a first album, as a first solo record, I think is damn near perfect. What are your thoughts on Avalanche?
I think the album is okay. So I think that this is when I start kind of not loving the stuff Matthew Good is doing, and I like it and I enjoy some things about it. I think that this album it's the most like the Matthew Good band, I think. And it's not like it's all over the place. It's not like there's anything necessarily wrong with the album. It's produced very well. I can start kind of hearing the merits of a guy like Matthew Good being in a band versus, he's doing this on his own. It's, you know what it is? It's kind of like, for me, Morrissey versus the Smiths.
Wow. That's a good comparison.
With just Morrissey, I get the awesome stuff that Morrissey brought with the Smiths, and it's good. His voice is good. He's got this kind of like a weird dramatic delivery to what he does, and kind of like a simple, kind of like a reimagining of a crooner kind of a thing. But I only get that, and that's all it is. And to me, just after a short bit, it just wears a little bit. Not that it's bad. It's just not as enjoyable to me just to have that element. This album, as far as I'm concerned, with him and his solo stuff, this is going to be the high water mark, and this is probably the best of it. I like Weapon and A World Called Catastrophe. I essentially like pretty much more than the first half of the album. I think maybe the second, third of it starts to meander a bit with me personally.
So you do not.
But that being said,
you're not a huge fan of Avalanche or While We Were Hunting Rabbits.
Let's think. I like the first half of the album. So While We're Hunting Rabbits, I like. It's, I think, where we get to Near Fantastica is where my interest kind of wanes a little bit. I probably dig the first 2/3 pretty good. I think it's solid. I don't think it's nearly as good as where the Matthew Good band left off. I think it's really good, just not that good.
Well, yeah.
I can feel you. You're about to pull a Bill Cosby and reach through the phone and strangle me here. I can tell.
Ooh, Ghost Dad reference. I like that, man. If we were going to, if I was going to tell somebody to check out Matthew Good as a solo artist, I probably would suggest this record. I think it's probably the most accessible of his solo records, and it sounds.
I would say so.
The production on it. When I first heard this album, I liked it. Before I even really dove into the songs, the production really caught me. I loved the layering, and I loved the orchestra on top of stuff. And then I grew to really appreciate the album over time. I think the song While We Were Hunting Rabbits is my favorite song of it's one of my favorite songs of his. It's definitely my favorite song on this record. I think it's one of my favorite vocal performances ever. That song especially, and most of the record is kind of dealing with the weight of what he was feeling, what he was feeling at the time, with kind of not being in control of his own destiny. The record is in a lot of ways indulgent. And if you like the first 3 tracks, you're going to love the rest of the record, but you're going to get a lot. A lot of these songs are overly long, and I think I like it and I enjoy it, but I could also see where if everything was whittled away and edited down, it could be a more cohesive record for maybe the average fan. But it is definitely a high watermark for him in his career. Matthew Good wasted no time going back in the studio, and in 2004 decided to record White Light Rock and Roll Review. Now, while he was touring for Avalanche, he really began to feel that the idea of playing in a band is great. I just didn't like the band I was playing with. And so his new live band, they began to gel, and he really kind of fell in love with the idea of recording with a band again. And so White Light Rock and Roll Review is essentially a cut live on the floor record that Good recorded with his band. Most of the songs here were recorded live. The song Blue Skies Over Badlands, which Dale Earnhardt has said, yes, the American NASCAR driver has said is his favorite song of all time, was recorded in a single take live by the band. And if you ever listen to anybody who listens to that song, that fact blows my mind, because it is a beautifully performed song. But this record is basically
that's definitely a well-rehearsed band, for sure.
It's just a ripper of an album. It's just it sounds like a live set, and that's what I think the intention was. There's a couple country deviations on this record which I think work exceedingly well, and all in through it's one of my favorite Matthew Good records. It just rocks from start to finish in a really good classic Rolling Stones sort of way. Carl, what were your thoughts on this record?
Yeah, I want to go back and take away something I said and move it around here. This is the one I think is probably the best individual Matthew Good album in my opinion.
Nice.
Poor Man's Gray is great. Put out your lights. I think this whole album from one end to the other is pretty much fantastic. In fact, I'm trying to think of if there was anything on this album that I just plain didn't like, but I don't think there was. I might rank this. I might rank this right up there with how I feel of the Audio of Being. I think that this album's great. While We're Hunting Rabbits, I love that tune. But yeah, I had no idea that I didn't know that Dale Earnhardt. We're talking Junior, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't know that Junior there. I didn't even know he knew Matthew Good was. But yeah, Blue Skies Over Badlands is great for a relatively short album. This is, for a 50-minute album. This is pretty much all you can ask for. I mean, it's from one end to the other. It's pretty fantastic.
Well, it's so incredibly cohesive, and then it's also the record that I think if you're looking for something muscular, like kind of in the vein of the heavier moments from Matthew Good, you get it here, but there's more swagger. There's, like I said, it just reminds me a lot of like the Stones and the Faces. The band is rocking, but not in a 90s alternative rock way. And I think that lyrically, there's a lot of
they close the album out great too. I mean, just the expats of the Blue Mountain Symphony Orchestra is Jesus. That is one of the best closers I think I've heard on an album.
Well, and even that It's Been a While Since I Was Your Man, that song for a long time, I was kind of like, ugh, why is this song on here? And I've actually come to really appreciate it because everything feels like it works together, and the record flows incredibly well, and it rocks without feeling like it's trying to rock. And there's a lot of there's some political overtones here. This is a post 9/11 world. George Bush is president, and I feel like Matthew Good does an incredibly good job here of making a political record that I don't feel sounds dated, because he doesn't. There's none of those like ill-timed, Bushisms. Like we're gonna with the things like that Pearl Jam was doing at the time. That kind of really date material. I think. There's obviously some overtones. Alert Status Red. We're making fun of the terror alerts, and that kind of stuff, but. It's not overt, it's very under the surface, and the record sees in all the right ways, in my opinion. So I'm glad you enjoyed it. Do you feel like this band is as good of a band as the Matthew Good, like the band playing under him? Do you feel like or is it just a different animal?
Oh, no. As far as the band goes, it's a little bit of a different animal. I mean, you could tell that, the nexus of all this is Matthew Good. So, there's some very strong sonic and song writing kind of carryover from one to the other. But as far as is the band as good? Yeah, absolutely. I agree with, he's got a good way of doing, lyrics with political overtones with not just being so forward stated, even if they weren't dated. Like when I listen to Skin sing Practically Anything, I think to myself, that's great, but man, that is really literal kind of all the time. And he's got a good way of kind of like, this is just, the way I think and feel about it. And I'm going to say it in just as deep a way that I would say about pretty much anything that he, thinks or feels about anything. I think the band itself is just as good. We're not talking about anybody's trying to play Dream Theater stuff here. The goal here is, can you sound, like you're a band? Can you sound like a rock band? Can you be kind of like tight and loose at the same time, which isn't easy to do, when I think that they do a fantastic job of it.
High praise. So, Carl, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had your heart broken?
Everybody's had their heart broken. Literally, once somebody took my heart out, broke it in two, and then that put it back in. It was terrible.
So, following White Light Rock and Roll Review, Matthew Good's personal life kind of fell into a period of upheaval. The pressures that had been mounting since his time with the band, the Matthew Good Band, finally came to a head in his personal life. He suffers a divorce. He ends up in the hospital. For anybody who's interested in Matthew Good, the artist, and maybe doesn't know much about him personally, he did it. Have you ever watched TED Talks? Do you know what a TED Talk is?
Yeah, I know what a TED Talk. I haven't actually watched a whole TED Talk, but I know what they are.
So he does a TED Talk a couple years back, and it's great. So Matthew Good is as present day Matthew Good is a strong, staunch advocate for mental health, and for good reason. So he tells the story that leads up to this next record. Matthew Good is living at his parents' house. He ends up overdosing on some medicine, and he's in the hospital. He's recovering, and he starts to really take a mental inventory of what's going on and what led him to that point. And they find out first and foremost that, he has a serious issue. He's bipolar, and like a lot of creative people, famous creative people throughout history, he's not wired like everybody else, and it's been working against him at points. It's also been working for him. And so while he's in the hospital recovering and kind of sorting his life out, he writes in his head the record Hospital Music. And he tells this story that he's in the hospital and he's thinking to himself, like, the lyrics and chord progressions, and he's realizing they're talking to him and asking him questions, and he's realizing, like, yeah, like, I don't think everything's okay. Like, I'm not okay with what's going on in my life. So he gets out and basically records very quickly, in about a month, the album Hospital Music, which is a very personalized chronicling of what led up to and what the aftermath was of the event that almost cost him his life. And so the record is brazenly personal. It is stark. The opening song, Champions of Nothing, nearly 10 minutes long, all the way through to the Daniel Johnston cover, True Love Will Find You in the end. It's just if you like singer-songwriters, and I know a lot of people maybe think of Matthew Good now as a singer-songwriter. This is his singer-songwriter record. A man with an acoustic guitar and a bunch of sad songs. And this is, Carl, the record that I actually discovered and fell back in love with Matthew Good, that 10 years later. This was the record I discovered, and it blew my mind then, and it still does. I don't think it's a perfect record, but if we're looking for examples of an artist bearing their soul, I cannot think of something more appropriate than this album. What were your thoughts on Hospital Music?
Well, this is where, how do I put it? All right. So if I were to, as I will, start comparing bands and albums to how I feel they stack up to Peter Criss's solo album, this is where
don't do it.
I'm doing it. This is where Matthew Good for me starts. It's almost like every album in a row starts to, like, for me, be like below Peter Criss's solo album, where I may be like a quarter or half the album, and the rest of it I think is a snooze fest. And I'm gonna get a little repetitive for the next few albums, but this is kind of where the whole every time I sing anything, I'm gonna do it like this all the time. It gets really old for me, and it never stops one album to the other all the day long. And like it wears on me a little bit. And this is where the Morrissey comparison for me really stands out, because this is Matthew Good to like the nth degree. And it's not like it's bad. If you like it, you like it. I think the Devil's in Your Details is great.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I think on this album, I might like 4 or 5 songs out of a 15 track album. So, I guess I'm Not Safer Than a Bank doesn't really count as a tune, but it's a track. So yeah, I'm not really that high on this. This is where I kind of start checking out with Matthew Good a little bit. Well produced, it sounds great. He sings with a lot of conviction, and the lyrics are good. I mean, it's not like there's anything lacking lyrically. I just don't really enjoy the tunes.
Well, I will give you this. The record is obviously a personal catharsis, and if that catharsis does not resonate with you, then it really kind of takes away the album's strength. I will admit, the song Black Helicopter, that song has never done anything for me. I just wish it wasn't on the record. Songs like Girl Wedged on the Front of a Firebird, like the little kind of music, and there's a couple of those on Avalanche, kind of the joke tracks. Those don't do anything for me. But She's in it for the money. I mean, that's talking about the idea that you're with a woman for 10 years, and your fame and your fortune becomes what she's attached to, and the idea that you realize you're in the middle. That's what While We Are Hunting Rabbits is about. He's basically talking about the idea that your band, your management, your wife, the woman you share your bed with, everybody is the enemy. And you wake up one day and you realize that you have nobody. Nobody's really there for you. And this record, I think, kind of really chronicles in a really artistic way that idea. And if you're looking for a down and out, Nick Drake-esque record, something that's solemn, somber, melancholy, whatever you want to call it, this record is so just that shade of gray, and that's all it is from start to finish, that it's either beautiful or you should just never listen to it. But there's not, like you just said, I don't think there's and for good reason, there's not a lot of variety. Because it is a very focused album. I just happen to think it's beautiful, but I won't deny that without that, I don't know that the songwriting is, the most clever, and I don't think it was supposed to be. And I don't know that the vocals or the production are as, again, it's very raw, like I'm sure he was. And so the record definitely resonated with me, but I could see how if it didn't, it might be hard to grab a hold of it. I do enjoy, I hope you sing the rest of your responses to me. Might be the best moment in this podcast history.
I think that there's probably a 1,000 Canadians, who listen to this balling their fists, who are like, I can't believe you're making fun of the way Matt Good sings. And,
well, I'm hoping 1,000
we're not going to give you my address.
Yes. No, we will just tell you that he's not in Canada, so go fish. Yeah. So Matthew Good, things turn around. Hospital Music is very well received, and he goes back in the studio and releases in 2009 Vancouver, which is a concept record of sorts, kind of a politicized album, similar in the way that White Light Rock and Roll Review was, except that it focuses on the city of Vancouver and the idea that the problems that are facing the inner cities in the U.S. aren't just facing them. Every city's facing them. And he kind of makes a very political record, but it's political, again, with underneath the surface. The record is, in my opinion, is genius. I love the record. I think the song Last Parade, I think the song Us Remains Impossible, they just genius pop songs. But then there's a lot of more, some of the more long-winded stuff. Matthew Good vocally, he's rarely sounded so angry, I think, on a record as he does on this one. Every song, it just feels like he's like spitting in the microphone. And so the record, I don't think it's his best record, but it was a good follow-up to Hospital Music. It's him and a band kind of rocking out again, and I think if you are looking for touchstones on this record, I think the song Volcanoes and the last track, Empty's Theme Park, probably are worth the price of admission by themselves. What were your thoughts on Vancouver?
Yeah, Vancouver I did enjoy a little bit more than Hospital Music. I thought that Us Remains Impossible was fantastic. I thought Volcanoes was great. Silent Army in the Trees. I thought these tracks stood out really well. And Vancouver National Anthem, I thought that was good. For the most part, I thought it was great. I didn't really catch or really know much about it being a concept album of sorts, but I still take Peter Criss's solo album over this, but it's better. This is an album that, after White Light and Rock and Roll Review, like this is an album where I can kind of listen to most of, where maybe more of Hospital Music to me is kind of a throwaway.
Oh man, well, that I'm appreciating this a lot. So Carl, this next record we're going to talk about, I want to ask you, I'm going to preface this with, is there a piece of music? Is there a piece of art? Is there a book? Is there a movie? Is there something that you feel so connected with, it's almost like a lost family member? Is there something that's impacted you so greatly as a human being that you cannot imagine your life being the same without it?
Well, we all know that I don't read books. So that one's out. To be frank with you, no. And that probably explains a lot about how I approach when we discuss music and movies and film. Because no, there isn't a piece of art that impacts me that way. I will say this. I think that things like reading novels, I'm going to focus on books on this one, because I think that this is where this is most apt. But I think what I'm about to say kind of has a universal application. I think listening to music or watching movies and enjoying them in a particular way, in a very artistic way, and really falling in love with them in an artistic way takes a certain kind of imagination. And I especially think this is true with books. Anything that's nonfiction, be them a fantasy or adventure novels, or novels that are really character-based, really based around relationships between people, or really just based around places and themes. I think that they take a certain type of imagination to enjoy, because without an imagination, trying to put images or smells or sounds to picture to words is not easy. And I don't have that kind of imagination. I just don't. I read a lot of stuff. I can't read fiction. I don't have that kind of imagination. And for the most part, when watching movies or even television, honestly, like, I'm much more concerned with the craft that I'm watching. I'm much more concerned with, listening for production or watching actors deliver what they're delivering than necessarily getting something out of the drama. Certain things hit me harder than others. When I watch Unforgiven or Bridges of Madison County, I think to myself, the drama in that is so good, it actually pulls me into the film and allows me to enjoy it without nitpicking at it. But I don't think that I have the capacity for that type of an imagination to really embrace a movie or a piece of music or a piece of art like what you're talking, where like this outside thing affects me so much that like I can't imagine my life without it. I'm just too flat. I don't think that like I have the capacity to view the world in that way.
Fair enough. I think that a very eloquent answer to a question that
I mean, you've known me my whole life. Yeah, to a yes or no question, that's a great 5-minute response.
No.
You've known me my whole life, though. I mean, what do you think about that premise overall? I mean, I just think that there are some people who get engaged with art more that I think, knowing some of these people like you, I think, you've got kind of this bigger creativity and imagination that I think kind of allows you to really connect with things that way.
Carl, I have watched movies and had them mess me up. I have listened to music and had it mess up my mood. I admire and have always admired from afar your pragmatism. You are, I think, a perfectly balanced person, and that you're able to enjoy it, but you maybe digest it in a more clinical way, take what you need from it to make you better at something, and then discard the rest. And I think that a good artist, falls in love with art, and a great artist is able to create. And sometimes I feel like I've been, stifled by my inability to separate the two. So that being said, all of that brings us to Lights of Endangered Species. Now, Carl, if I was going to cite the piece of art that my life would not be the same without, I would cite this record. It is my favorite record of all time, and I am so thankful that it's not something I went back to and discovered. I was there, when this was released in 2011, it blew my mind, and it has been blowing my mind in the 6 years since, and it to me is a flawless record. Matthew Good wanted to make a record free of concession. He was going to make a purely artistic statement, and the only member of the audience he was concerned about pleasing was himself, and the result of that was Lights of Endangered Species. Now, in the press before this record's release, he kind of knew, I think, that he hadn't created a fan favorite. He even went as far to say that I'm not going to be surprised if nobody likes the record, but I wanted to make at least one for myself. And this record, which is heavily embellished with orchestral strings, it's a very quiet, brooding album that has some big like orchestral crescendos, but otherwise simmers. And in my opinion, is like a perfectly constructed album. It very much, I think, features his high watermark in regards to lyrics and vocals. And I think there's stuff on here that I'm still wrapping my head around how good it is and how well done it is. But the record was met with mixed results. It's not a guitar-driven record. It's more big band and jazz in places than anything else. But if you are a fan of post-rock, if you are a fan of jazz, this might be a record that I would say, hey, you might not like Matthew Good's catalog, but check out this one record. It's a really interesting, diversion from what he does. What were your thoughts on Lights of Endangered Species? Interesting is probably the best way to sum up my thoughts on the album for the most part. I like maybe 4 or 5 tunes on it. I think Shallow's Low has like a really nice build, but to me the track doesn't really go anywhere after that. The title track at the end is kind of great, but again, I kind of think the end of it meanders. I like Non-Populous. I thought Zero Orchestra was great. I thought the What If I Can't See the Stars was amazing, but I think outside of that, maybe I liked In Place of a Lesser Man. I don't know. I had a really hard time really getting attached to this one. So another one where I'm going to say, isn't as good as Peter Criss's solo album, but Peter Criss, I hope his sales are going up after our Kiss podcast. They are not. I listened to it again the other day, and I still don't get why so many people hate it. But
I'm glad that you like it, and I'm glad that you have an attachment to it.
Now you're sounding like you're sounding like Megan. I'm glad you like it. If I had a nickel.
Well, at the end of the day, I mean, joke's on me if I'm going to listen to an album and not really enjoy it and nitpick at it, the person who likes it and gets something out of it, they're going to be in a better spot. But this is the first one in a bit that it didn't even go Canadian gold.
Yeah, I mean, it's and I think
I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Right? I mean, there's nothing. If you listen to Beautiful Midnight and you listen to this, does it even sound like the same artist? Like it's so far removed from
except for the singing on the album, yeah, there doesn't really sound much like the same. Yeah. Aside from that, not really, no.
But I can't. If anybody who's listened this far into the podcast takes anything away from it, I urge you to revisit Lights of Endangered Species. And if it doesn't click, just keep listening to it until it does. Because to me, it is a genius record. And I think the song Set Me on Fire might be his best lyric that he's ever written. And I think the song Non-Populous might be my favorite of his epic tracks. And yeah, I think he kills it, man. So Matthew Good kind of sensing, I think, that he had made a really strong artistic statement. And where do you go from there? Well, if you're Matthew Good, you decide to make an equally stark artistic statement. And in 2013, he releases Arrows of Desire, which is a straight up rock and roll album. But Carl, unlike White Light Rock and Roll Review, this record rocks and has muscle and rocks in a modern rock way. He was listening to a lot of Pixies and Afghan Wigs. The Afghan Wigs, by the way, are one of my favorite bands. And this record, it doesn't sound like the Pixies or Afghan Wigs, but I get where he was going with it. He just puts on an electric guitar and goes in the studio, and he makes the record. If I was going to say that a record reminds me of a record that I could imagine you making, it would be this record. It's heavy, it's muscular, it's layered, it has a big, grand kind of feel to it in different places, and it really plays to, I think, his strengths as a songwriter. So I really enjoyed this record. It's not my favorite Matt Good record because it's so focused on being kind of rocking that I wish it just had a little bit more nuance. But the last track, Letters in Wartime, I think is just stupid good, stupid crushing. What were your thoughts on this record?
Yeah, I have pretty much the same thoughts, except that I like the fact that Matt, if there's one word I could say to describe Matthew Good as like an individual performer, the word I would use is nuanced. And I'm kind of glad that we get a little bit of a departure from that. So I'm actually kind of glad that, that this is a little more of a muscular album. And this, again, that's something that I can kind of latch on to. So I think I'm actually coming out in this conversation as the meathead here. But this album I like almost all of. Maybe a couple tracks on, or like I'm not so high on. Maybe Mutineering isn't my favorite, but I think Letters in Wartime is fantastic. The opening is great. Via Dolorosa, I mean, just almost from one end to the other, I think this one's good. If you were not a fan of the kind of more droning, meandering Matthew Good, and you're a fan of like the Matthew Good band, and you wanted a little more of that, White Light Rock and Roll and then this one are probably the two ones that you're going to get.
That's a good call. Yeah.
The most. And you know what? Actually, I take back. I'm getting confused here. Mutineering, I thought rocked. It was Everything. Well, bear with me here. I thought maybe it was like Guns of Carolina. I don't remember. There were one or two. Yeah, maybe that was the one. There was a snoozer on here that I just plain didn't like, and it might have been that one. But I thought Mutineering was great. Letters in Wartime was a great way to close it.
Yeah, the record did good, and kind of continued to establish him as a rock and roll solo artist. Matthew Good decided to follow up that record a year later by going into the studio and recording Chaotic Neutral. Was released in September of 2015. Now, this record. By this time, Carl, I'm, obviously man-crushing hard on Matthew Good, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was disappointed. The leading track, All You Sons and Daughters, came out, and I was like, well, it's not the best song I've ever heard, and then the second track came out, was released, was Girls in Black, and I was like, I don't know what that song is doing. And then I listen to the record. I get the record, and it's like half of it's ballads, and it's like the whole second half of it's just like slow songs. And I was like, I don't get this. And then at one day, I just was like, no, this is genius. The song "Tiger by the Tail," the song "Cold Water." These songs are great. "Cloud Busting," the cover of the Kate Bush track with Holly McNarland on counter vocals, is genius. And this record is perfectly produced. This might be my favorite produced Matthew Good record yet. Big, strong rhythm section, beautiful piano, like busting out of these songs. And I now think that this is my second favorite Matthew Good record. I love this record from start to finish. I love the kind of ebb and flow. It's kind of loud and then soft and then loud and soft. And I think the last track, Los Alamos, it might be his best ballad that he's ever recorded. It's one of the most haunting songs that I've ever heard of. And just that line, the other side of town, like just that kind of line that he keeps repeating in the song, it just hits me every time. What were your thoughts on Chaotic Neutral?
Yeah, you said that this was the first time you were disappointed in a span of years. This was like the fifth time I was disappointed in the span of a couple days. I didn't. This one, again, I'm kind of 50-50 on. I mean, maybe way less than 50-50, actually. I like Cloud Busting. I'm not super familiar with Kate Bush, but when you made the Kate Bush reference, it made sense because, I mean, it isn't often that I hear something from Kate Bush that I don't like. But I thought All Your Sons and Daughters was good. I thought Moment was good. No Liars, Harden. But I mean, honestly, outside of that, I wasn't a huge fan. It was popular. It got another nomination. People seem to like it, but for me personally, I'm taking Peter Criss again. I can't. Not really a lot here that I'm good that I can really latch on to.
Fair enough. I'm starting to feel bad because I did kind of force you to listen to the Matthew Good discography, and I did not intend for it to disappoint you so greatly. But I'm hoping.
Oh no! Don't feel bad. I've told you the story about my wife took me to see Dwight Yoakam.
You should tell it again. It's a great story.
Yeah, my wife takes me to see Dwight Yoakam because I'm a huge Dwight Yoakam fan, and Dwight Yoakam is opening up for Eric Church, who I can't stand, and she's an Eric Church fan, but I'm not. And so, like a couple minutes into the first track, Eric Church was playing, I looked over at her, and she said, "Are you enjoying this?" And I had a huge smile on my face and like a big excited look, and I said, "This is so bad, it's horrible." And the thing that she did, so she was kind of bummed out because she's trying to take me to have a good time, and I'm here. I am, having a good time with Dwight, but I'm kind of riffing on Eric Church. And the thing I kept trying to tell her was like, "No, you don't get it. Like, it's almost more fun to me if like I can hear something and not like it, and if I can have something that gives me something to kind of digest, and to kind of pick apart, because you can digest and pick apart something that you like, but there's no consequence to it. You like it. At the end of the day, there's plenty of things that I know that aren't good, but if I like it, it doesn't really matter if it's not good. It doesn't matter what I say about it. But there's something that there's kind of a good mental exercise, and you have to listen to something and you have to talk about it. You've got to go do a podcast on this, so you can't sound like you're sick of it. You can't sound like you're tired of it. You actually have to have an intelligent thing to say on this, and you actually have to be able to talk about it. And that, to me, is the big exercise. So no, don't feel bad. It was actually getting kind of boring because when we started the podcast, we're doing a total fan wank, and we're doing, we could talk about all these things that we love. And to be frank with you, that was actually kind of getting a little old. And I think finally having something where we're in different positions on, I think it kind of is more fun sometimes than us talking about Dream Theater.
I don't disagree. Yeah. So, and I was going to say, I hope that all the disappointment was made up for by Matthew Good's latest album, Something Like a Storm, which was released yesterday. So we've been waiting a couple weeks for this record to come out. Now, Carl, I pre-ordered it on vinyl. I had a big article I had to write about it. I was waiting for this record, and I'm not going to lie. Whereas Chaotic Neutral, the singles and the record like didn't grab me at first, and then I fell in love with it. This one I was a little worried because the singles really didn't grab me. Like Bad Guys Win really wasn't doing anything for me, and that Days Come Down song was really not doing anything for me. But then Matthew Good released the title track as a single last week, Something Like a Storm, and it might be It's just such a freaking ridiculously good song. And that song and the last track, Bullets in a Briefcase, both these kind of like super epic-y. This is probably the most beautiful midnight Matthew Good has sounded since recording Beautiful Midnight. These songs like just immediately reminded me of songs like Born to Kill, just kind of these big, somber, plotting epics. And then the whole record came into focus. And I actually think this record's great. It has obviously a very strong new wave kind of 80s rock throwback feel. There's songs that sound like The Police. There's songs that sound like The Cure. And I love that kind of music, and I think this record is great. I'm not sure yet where I would put it in the pantheon, like what order I would rank it, but super excited, of course. I just got done saying for an hour how much I love Matthew Good. What were your thoughts on Something Like a Storm? Anything stick out here?
I think what sticks out is half of it sounds like a U2 album with big drums and him singing on top of it. Like, I just kind of want to know, like, did the Edge join the band? It just kind of has, like, that, like you said, it kind of has, like, this 80s new wave kind of thing going on, but I don't know. It's like Bad Guys Win. When, like, I hear the guitar, I kind of hear, like, a little bit of a U2 in there. But for the most part, though, I'm not saying that as too big of a negative, but for the most part, I enjoyed the album. I like albums that kind of have, like, big dramatic build-ups. I like songs like that. Bullets in a Briefcase is a great example of that. Something Like a Storm is a great example of that. I thought that where was it? See, you didn't like Bad Guys Win, but I heard that track.
No, I like it now. I think at first I wasn't really digging it.
Yeah, well, it was. I think it's a good opener. The video to it's a little interesting. It's kind of a little over the top obvious for me, but aside from that, though, no, I thought that this is good. This is, where maybe I think I'm still taking Peter Criss's solo album over this one, but probably not by much. Yeah, but it's good. I don't like it as much as Beautiful Midnight, White Light Rock and Roll Review, or Arrows of Desire. Like, I don't like it as much as those. It's really close though. I don't really think there's not too many songs on here that I'm tossing away. I don't really too much dig that She's Got You or She Wants You, but for the most part, it's not bad.
Yeah, I mean, and the live band that he's been touring with the last couple of years, so Stuart Cameron on guitars, Blake Manning on drums, and then Peter Fusco on bass. These guys, man, I think it's a freaking great band, and they sound great on this album. Again, it has a live on the floor feel, but then it's super layered on top, and I think the guitars especially, I actually really enjoy the guitar work on the record. You're right, it is very U2-esque, but I think I love U2, so you can't really go wrong there. I think this record is great from start to finish, and Bad Guys Win, especially in the context of what follows it. I think it actually really works as an opener, and I like the thundering drums more and more. So, I think it's a keeper. You're gonna turn the tables on me in a second, and I'm sure you're gonna ask me to rank these Matthew Good albums. Then I'm gonna sit there and stumble for the next 5 minutes. But I definitely, it's not at the top of the list, but it's somewhere in there. Now, Carl, that being said, we've kind of run through the Matthew Good band and then the Matthew Good solo stuff. So we didn't even talk about the compilations and the B-sides, but obviously a very prolific artist.
I know, we didn't hit like the Ray Guns or anything like that.
He's got 8 solo records. The Matthew Good band had at least 4 proper releases. There's all kinds of compilations and B-sides and live collections. What are your thoughts on the whole body of work? Do you put him up there with the Tea Party and the Big Wreck and the other big Canadian guys? Do you think it holds up, or you think he really just peaked with the Matthew Good band and the solo stuff's its own thing?
I don't hold him up there with, the Tea Parties or the Big Wrecks. He didn't kind of peak with Matthew Good because he kind of had some real high watermark moments later on. His whole career reminds me a lot of how I feel about many of his albums, or that there are these amazing albums sprinkled out, but there's a lot of meandering in between. But that being said, it's not like, it's not like the Megadeth thing where you go out to make like the best album ever every time you go in, and you succeed a handful of times and then you just make crappy records here and there. Matthew Good goes out to make an album at a very of a type. Like, he goes out to say, like, I'm going to do this today. and that's what he does, and then he just kind of delivers that. So it's very focused. I don't think that when I listen to this career that his career is necessarily meandering. I think some of the albums sound like that to me, but for the most part, I think it sounds like he's doing pretty much everything he wants to whenever it is that he wants to do it. And to that end, you got to call it a success. If it's art, if you create the thing you wanted to create, then great. That's the thing that you wanted to do. It's not like what you did was a mistake or an accident or something you didn't want. That being said, I probably enjoy maybe a little less than half his career, where I would think, Big Record, The Tea Party, I probably enjoy 80, 90% of their careers. And, maybe I'm only left with kind of kicking around maybe parts of albums here or there, So not up there with the Big Recs or the Tea Parties, but he's a success. He does what he wants to do, and that's what you get. And if you like it, great. And if you don't, then you're really not going to like it.
So I guess I'm going to ask you to give me your top 3 records, but I feel like you're probably going to say Beautiful Midnight's up there, and then maybe the 2 rocker solo records, or maybe Audio of Being. What's your top 3?
I would say, God, because Audio of Being's good. If I had to label drop it at 3. Jeez. His Audio Being's good, but probably Beautiful Midnight. Probably Beautiful Midnight, Audio of Being, and then probably White Light Rock and Roll Review.
Man, that's a good choice. That's hard. If I'm going to rank the albums, the thing I run into is I feel like there's different records for different moods, and he's not really done the same record over and over again, so I have a hard time, but I basically think that the way I would do a list is I would start with Lights of Endangered Species, and then I would just have to slide stuff in and then just be bummed at the stuff that ends up at the bottom. But, would I take a Matthew Good Band record over any of the Matthew Good records? Probably, so that's a hard one. But I would probably go Lights of Endangered Species, Chaotic Neutral, and Avalanche as like the trifecta at the top, and then I'd probably put, Hospital Music and White Light, Rock and Roll Review, and Beautiful Midnight and Audio of Being as the second tier. And then I guess I'd slide the rest under that. But even like Arrows of Desire, which I don't find myself going back to a lot, I feel like when I'm in a specific mood, that record really scratches that itch. So I don't know that I can line these children up, in any sort of order. But I can't say enough about Lights of Endangered Species. I just think that record, just everything about that record just really nails it, in my opinion. So
how people aren't really supposed to pick favorites of their kids.
Yes.
I kind of think of this band as like your kids, where I can appreciate your kids, but there are definitely favorites I have.
But they keep putting the hands on the wall, so will you just freaking tell them to stop it? Just paint it. God. Yeah, no. So, Carl, there's a podcast I listen to, The Talking Dead, which is out of, it features Chris and Jason, and they do their podcast out of Canada. So I've been listening to their podcast quite a bit. They do breakdowns of The Walking Dead and Fear the Walking Dead episodes, and I've been wanting to do this topic for a long time because I've been waiting for a moment to shout out their podcast, but they're a Canadian podcast, and I feel like they all the time are talking about American things and then having to kind of relate it back to Canada. And I often feel like it's got to suck. There's so much pop culture that just kind of just forgets about Canada, and so I thought this was a really cool way to kind of shout them out, because we're obviously doing a Canadian-themed podcast with a Canadian artist, and I think that music scene is so alive and so strong, and it's very interesting to me that, I guess not being Canadian and not, ever really traveling around Canada as an adult, I have an impression of it. It's definitely a place I want to visit, especially Toronto, but I feel like they do a really good job of supporting their artists and kind of keeping that scene insulated. So I'm just going to give those guys a shout out. I really enjoy their podcast, and anybody who's listening to this, if you have any inkling to listen to breakdowns on The Walking Dead, that's pretty much all they talk about, but it's funny and well done. The Talking Dead is a podcast that I highly recommend. And I wanted to ask you, do you have any final thoughts on Matthew Good? And maybe you would like to sing those thoughts to me.
But I don't have that many thoughts on Matthew Good. No, I don't really. I don't really have any final thoughts. He's not much my thing. There's some albums that I'll listen to. There's some things that I can get into, but when I'm driving around in my car and I'm gonna go reach for something, it almost never occurs to me to reach for Matthew Good. That being said, it's not like Radiohead where I just avidly don't like it. There's just some things I do and things I don't, and it just doesn't really pop into my head. But if you are one of the people who like Matthew Good, then hats off to you. You're in a way better spot than I.
And for anybody who's made it this far, thank you so much for listening, and be sure to check us out again. If you have any feedback for the show, geekusa podcast@gmail.com, and you can follow us on Twitter at geekusa_podcast.